Introduction. Why Machiavelli still rules the world. Let me be honest with you before we go any further. Friend to friend, no marketing gloss. You picked up this book because somewhere in your life, at work, in your family, in a relationship, in a negotiation that went sideways, you watched someone with far less talent than you walk away with far more power. You watched it happen, and you felt something between fascination and disgust. That feeling is exactly where Niccolò Machiavelli started too. In 1513, Machiavelli was a disgraced former diplomat, tortured and exiled by the Medici family he once served in Florence. Sitting in forced retirement, broke and humiliated, he wrote a short book to try to win back a job. That book was The Prince. It was not written for saints. It was written for a world he had personally watched devour honest men and reward ruthless ones. He wasn't inventing cruelty. He was simply the first major Western writer willing to describe power as it actually operates, rather than how priests and philosophers insisted it should. Here is the sentence that got him branded Satanic for 5 centuries. It is much safer to be feared than loved. Not because love is worthless, but because love depends on other people's goodwill. And goodwill is fragile, while fear you can control yourself. That single idea offended an entire civilization that wanted to believe virtue always wins. History, unfortunately, keeps proving otherwise. I'm not going to pretend this book is only self-defense, the way most authors in this genre nervously insist. Some of what's in these pages you will use to protect yourself. Some of it, if you're honest, you will use to get what you want. Both are legitimate. The people who tell you power is beneath them are, almost without exception, people who have never had to survive without it. Here's the deal I'm making with you for the next 30 chapters. I'll show you exactly how control, influence, and domination actually work, grounded in real history, real psychology, real documented human behavior, from the Borgias to Wall Street boardrooms to Stanley Milgram's laboratory at Yale. I won't ask you to become a monster. I will ask you to stop being naive. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Machiavelli understood better than almost anyone before or since. The world does not reward the person with the best intentions. It rewards the person who understands the game being played. You can refuse to learn the rules. Plenty of people do. They usually spend their lives wondering why decent, hard-working people keep losing to people who are neither. Let's change that for you. Turn the page. Part 1. The Foundations of Control. Law 1. Never reveal your full intentions. I want you to think about the last time someone completely outmaneuvered you. Chances are you saw it coming about halfway through, right when it was already too late to stop it. That delay, that half-beat where you finally understood what was happening, is the entire mechanism of this first rule. Machiavelli wrote that a wise ruler should be a great fegner and dissembler, someone who reveals actions only, never the reasoning or the target behind them. This wasn't cynicism for its own sake. It was pure risk management. Every intention you announce becomes a target other people can attack, block, or steal before you get there. Look at Cesare Borgia, the historical figure Machiavelli most admired and used as his real-world template for The Prince. When Cesare wanted to seize the Romagna region of Italy in 1500-1501, he didn't announce a campaign of conquest. He arrived first as an ally helping local lords deal with unrest, appointed a brutally efficient governor named Ramiro de Orco to crush banditry and restore order, let the population's hatred build against Ramiro rather than himself. And then, once order was restored and the people despised the enforcer, had Ramiro executed and publicly displayed in the town square. The people, stunned and grateful, embraced Cesare as their liberator from his own creation. Every move looked like the previous move's natural conclusion. Nobody outside his inner circle understood the plan until it was finished. This same principle shows up constantly in modern negotiation research. Harvard's program on negotiation has documented for decades that negotiators who reveal their true reservation price, the lowest they'll actually accept, consistently get worse outcomes than those who keep it hidden and let the other side do the work of discovering boundaries through offers and counteroffers. Information asymmetry isn't a dirty trick, it's structural leverage. Here's how this plays out in your actual life. Say you want a promotion. The naive approach is telling your manager directly, "I want to be VP by next year." Now your manager knows your timeline, your ambition, and your urgency. 3 pieces of leverage you just handed away for free. They can slow walk you, use the promise of promotion to extract more unpaid effort, or simply file the information away as something to manage rather than deliver. The Machiavellian approach is different. You demonstrate the value of a VP without naming the title you want. You solve the problems a VP would solve. You let your manager arrive at the conclusion, "We need to promote this person," as though it were their own idea. Because ideas people believe are their own are far harder to abandon than ideas someone else pitched to them. Psychologists call this the IKEA effect, documented by Michael Norton, Daniel Mochen, and Dan Ariely in a 2011 study. People assign disproportionately higher value to things they believe they built or discovered themselves. When your manager thinks the promotion was their insight, they'll defend it as their own decision. When they know it was your campaign, they'll resent the pressure. None of this means lying constantly or manufacturing fake friendliness. It means separating what you do from why you do it, and understanding that the second piece is information, and information is currency. Machiavelli's actual line in Law 18 of The Prince is that a ruler need not have all the good qualities, but must absolutely appear to have them. Because most people judge by appearances and outcomes, and only a few ever get close enough to see the machinery underneath. Your job is to make sure the people who matter most only ever see the machinery once it's already running in your favor. Guard your why. Show only your what. That's the whole rule, and it will save you more damage than anything else in this book. Law 2. Assume everyone is playing a game, even if they don't know it. Here's something that will change how you read every room you walk into for the rest of your life. Most people are playing a status and survival game constantly, and most of them don't even know they're doing it. Machiavelli's core insight, the one that made him infamous, wasn't that people are evil. It was that people are self-interested by default, and any system of power that assumes otherwise will eventually be exploited and destroyed by the minority who understand this. In The Prince, he wrote plainly that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, the moment their own interest is at stake, and that a ruler who builds his strategy on people's better nature is building on sand. This isn't as bleak as it sounds once you understand the mechanism behind it. Evolutionary psychologists like Robert Trivers have spent careers documenting how deeply self-deception is wired into human social behavior. We lie to ourselves about our own motives so we can lie more convincingly to others. Because sincere-looking liars are harder to detect than calculating ones. Your coworker who insists she's just trying to help the team, while quietly undermining a rival for the same promotion, isn't necessarily being consciously dishonest. She may genuinely believe her own story. That doesn't make the game she's playing any less real. Consider corporate history's most studied case of hidden games, Enron in the early 2000s. Employees were told, and largely believed, they worked for the most innovative company in America. Behind that story, executives were running a status and incentive game where reported earnings, not real earnings, determined bonuses, so managers optimized entirely for the appearance of performance. Nobody in most departments thought of themselves as participants in fraud. They thought they were playing the ordinary game of hit your numbers, get promoted. The game was invisible to most of them until it collapsed in 2001, wiping out $74 billion in shareholder value and thousands of pensions. The practical lesson for you is this: stop asking, "Is this person being honest with me?" and start asking, "What game does this person think they're playing? And what would winning look like for them?" A colleague who constantly volunteers for high-visibility projects isn't being a team player by accident. She's playing a visibility game. A friend who always needs to be the one giving advice, never receiving it, is playing a status game. None of this makes them villains. It makes them human, and it makes their behavior predictable once you see the pattern. This is also where most people misread Machiavelli as cynical when he was actually just accurate. He didn't say to distrust everyone maliciously. He said to build your plans on realistic assumptions about incentive, not hopeful assumptions about character. The difference matters enormously. Trusting someone's character means being shocked when they disappoint you. Understanding someone's incentives means never being surprised, because you saw the pressure that would eventually move them before they did try this exercise. The next time you're in a meeting, a family gathering, or a negotiation, silently ask yourself what each person in the room is actually optimizing for, underneath what they're saying. You'll notice within minutes that the stated agenda and the real agenda are rarely identical. Once you can see both simultaneously, you stop being the only person in the room who's surprised by the outcome. Law 3. Control the frame before anyone else does. Whoever defines the terms of a conversation almost always wins it, long before either side says anything persuasive. This is called framing, and it's one of the most researched concepts in modern behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's landmark 1981 study on framing effects showed that people's decisions flip dramatically depending on whether identical information is presented as a gain or a loss. Told a medical treatment has a 90% survival rate, people choose it eagerly. Told the same treatment has a 10% mortality rate, people recoil, even though the numbers describe the exact same outcome. The facts never changed. Only the frame did. Machiavelli understood this instinctively, 5 centuries before behavioral economics had a name. He advised princes to control how their actions were perceived, not just what the actions were, arguing that a ruler who appears merciful, faithful, and pious, whether or not he consistently is, will be judged favorably by a public that has neither the time nor the access to examine the truth underneath the frame. The frame, in Machiavelli's world, was reality for everyone except the tiny circle close enough to see behind it. You've watched this happen in real time if you've paid attention to how companies handle layoffs. We're reducing headcount, and we're right-sizing the organization to focus on our highest impact priorities. Describe the identical event. One frame invites blame. The other invites acceptance, even gratitude for being one of the ones who stayed. Corporate communications teams are paid enormous salaries specifically to control this frame before journalists, employees, or shareholders can supply their own. Here's how to use this in ordinary life. Say you missed a deadline at work. The reactive move is apologizing and explaining what went wrong, which frames you as the person who failed. The framed move is walking in and saying, "I want to flag a scope issue before it becomes a bigger problem," which frames the same missed deadline as you proactively managing risk. Same facts. Completely different position in the listener's mind. Whoever speaks first, and speaks with the frame already built, usually sets the terms everyone else responds within. This works in disagreements too. Notice how skilled negotiators never argue on their opponent's terms. If someone accuses you of being difficult, don't defend against the word difficult. You've now accepted their frame and are fighting inside it. Reframe entirely. "I have high standards, and I'd rather raise this now than let it become expensive later." You didn't deny anything. You replaced their vocabulary with yours. And vocabulary is where arguments are actually won or lost. The danger and the reason this rule sits early in the book is that frames set by others will control you completely if you never learn to notice them. Every advertisement, every political slogan, every performance review you've ever received used framing on you, often to your disadvantage. Once you can see the seams, once you can ask, who chose these words, and what do they want me to feel because of them? You stop being framed by default and start choosing your own frame instead. That single shift, more than almost anything else in this book, is the difference between reacting to power and holding it. Law 4. Make yourself necessary, never replaceable. Loyalty is fragile, necessity is not. Machiavelli understood this distinction better than almost any political thinker before or after him, and it's the reason his fourth rule has outlived every empire that ignored it. In The Prince, Machiavelli repeatedly returns to a single anxious question that haunted every ruler he studied. What happens the day people stop needing you? Rulers who depended on being liked, he observed, fell the moment popularity shifted. And popularity always shifts. Rulers who made themselves structurally necessary, whose removal would cost more than their continued rule, survived crises that toppled far more beloved leaders around them. The clearest modern proof of this sits in labor economics, research on power in organizations, including work by sociologists Richard Emerson and later organizational theorists, established what's now called resource dependence theory. Power in any group is a direct function of how dependent others are on you for something they can't easily get elsewhere. It has nothing to do with how much people like you, how hard you work, or how long you've been there. It has everything to do with whether you control a resource, a relationship, a piece of knowledge, or a skill that the group cannot easily replace. This is why the most protected employees during layoffs are rarely the most liked. They're the ones who hold undocumented institutional knowledge, the sole client relationship, the only working understanding of a critical system. Companies will cut a beloved, competent generalist before they cut an abrasive specialist nobody else can replace. Because the abrasive specialist absence has an immediate, measurable cost, while the generalist absence is merely a loss of morale, expensive in feeling, cheap in dollars. Look at how the Medici family itself, the very dynasty Machiavelli served and was later betrayed by, maintained power in Florence for generations without formally holding political office for most of that period. They didn't rule through affection or even through official title. They ruled through banking, by making themselves the financial infrastructure that half of Europe's nobility, the papacy included, depended on. You could dislike the Medici. You could resent them. You could not easily remove them, because removing them meant removing your own access to capital. Here's the actionable version for you. Don't chase being liked at work, in your friend group, or in a relationship as your primary strategy. Likability is a nice bonus, not a foundation, because it can evaporate over a single bad week or a single rumor. Instead, ask yourself constantly, what do I know, control, or provide that would genuinely hurt this group, company, or relationship if I disappeared tomorrow? If you can't answer that clearly, you are currently replaceable. No matter how much affection surrounds you, build towards specific, hard-to-duplicate value. A relationship only you maintain, a system only you fully understand. A skill combination rare enough that finding your replacement takes real time and real cost. This is not about hoarding information out of pettiness, and it's not sustainable if you actively sabotage others' ability to learn. It's about ensuring that when the difficult decisions get made, who gets promoted, who gets cut, who gets believed in a dispute, the practical cost of losing you outweighs whatever short-term convenience might come from letting you go. Affection fades. Dependency doesn't. Law 5. Study people's weaknesses before you need them. The single biggest mistake most people make in relationships of any kind, professional, romantic, familial, is only paying attention to someone's strengths, their charm, their competence, the version of them they present in good moments. Machiavelli's fifth rule asks you to do the opposite. Pay closest attention to weakness, because weakness is what determines behavior under real pressure, and pressure is exactly when it matters most. This isn't about cruelty, it's about accuracy. Machiavelli's entire body of work, especially the discourses on Livy, is obsessed with a single recurring question. What does a person actually do when tested? Not what do they say they would do. He studied the collapse of the Roman Republic and countless Italian city-states, and found the same pattern repeatedly. Leaders who were charming, articulate, and confident in peacetime revealed catastrophic weaknesses. The moment a real crisis arrived, weaknesses nobody had bothered to map in advance because everyone was busy being charmed. Modern psychology gives us a precise language for this that Machiavelli lacked. Vulnerability under stress often maps closely to what psychologists call a person's core wound, the specific fear, abandonment, humiliation, inadequacy, loss of control, that, when triggered, overrides their normal judgment. Understanding someone's core wound isn't manipulation by itself. Therapists use this exact knowledge to help people heal. The manipulation begins only when that knowledge is used against someone's interest rather than for it, which is precisely why you need to be able to identify it in others before you decide how you'll use what you find. Here's a concrete, well-documented historical example. Adolf Hitler's rise depended heavily on identifying and exploiting a specific German psychological weakness in the 1920s and 1930s. A national wound of humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles and the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, which had destroyed the savings and dignity of the middle class. Hitler's early speeches, extensively documented by historians like Ian Kershaw, rarely opened with policy. They opened by reactivating that specific wound, describing humiliation, betrayal, and loss of status, before offering himself as the remedy. This is an extreme, horrifying case, and I include it deliberately, not as a model to follow, but as unambiguous proof of how devastatingly effective this mechanism is when someone maps a weakness accurately and exploits it without conscience. On a far smaller and more ordinary scale, you've seen this in any workplace where a manager consistently assigns the impossible, thankless project to the one employee whose weakness is an inability to say no, rooted in a fear of seeming uncommitted. That manager may not consciously think, "I am exploiting his fear of seeming lazy." But they've learned through repeated small experiments exactly which lever moves that particular person, and they pull it reliably. Your task, ethically applied, is twofold. First, map weaknesses in others primarily so you are never blindsided by them. The business partner whose fear of conflict means they'll agree to terms in the room and quietly resent and undermine them later. The friend whose need for approval means they'll say yes to plans they can't actually deliver. Second, and just as important, map your own weaknesses with the same clear eyes. Because if you can see your own core wound before someone else finds it, nobody can ever use it as a lever against you again. That second use of this rule is the one that will protect you the most. Law 6. Silence is a weapon. Use it deliberately. We are taught from childhood that silence is passive, the absence of action, the void between words that matter. Machiavelli would tell you that's exactly backward. Silence, used deliberately, is one of the most active tools of control available to anyone, and almost nobody wields it on purpose. Think about the discomfort of sitting across from someone who simply doesn't fill the space after you've made an offer, an apology, or an accusation. That discomfort isn't accidental. Negotiation researchers, including former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss in his widely cited work on tactical empathy, have documented that silence after a statement creates powerful pressure on the other party to fill the gap, often by revealing more than they intended, softening their position, or offering concessions nobody asked for. The first person to speak after an uncomfortable silence frequently loses leverage in that exchange, simply because discomfort, not logic, drove them to speak. Machiavelli's own diplomatic career, before his political downfall, was built on exactly this kind of restraint. As Florence's second chancery secretary from 1498 to 1512, he was sent on missions to read the intentions of far more powerful figures, Cesare Borgia among them, with almost no leverage of his own beyond careful observation and calculated withholding. His surviving diplomatic dispatches, still studied by historians today, show a man who understood that revealing Florence's anxiety, urgency, or true position handed the more powerful party exactly what they needed to exploit it. His job wasn't to talk, it was to watch what other people did when he refused to fill the silence for them. There's a well-documented psychological phenomenon behind why this works so reliably. People have an intense discomfort with conversational gaps, rooted in what sociolinguists call turn-taking norms, unconscious social rules about how quickly a response is expected. Break that norm even by 2 or 3 extra seconds, and most people's anxiety compels them to speak again, usually saying more than their first statement, often undermining or qualifying what they just said. Salespeople are explicitly trained on this. State your price, then say nothing. The next person to speak in an overwhelming majority of transactions is the buyer, and they usually speak toward your number, not away from it. Here's how you use this without becoming cold or manipulative in your close relationships, where trust actually matters more than leverage. In high-stakes moments, a salary negotiation, a difficult confrontation, a decision where you've stated your position clearly, resist the urge to soften, qualify, or explain further the moment you finish speaking. Let the silence sit. Watch what the other person does with it. You will learn more about their real position in 10 seconds of silence than in 10 minutes of them talking around a comfortable, pre-rehearsed answer. The flip side matters just as much. Recognize when someone is using silence on you. If you've just made a request and the other person goes quiet, notice the urge rising in your own chest to fill that space with justification, discount, or retreat, and resist it. That urge is the whole mechanism this law is about. The person who can sit inside an uncomfortable silence without flinching almost always controls the outcome of what happens after it. Part 2. Manipulating Perception. Law 7. Appearances are reality to most people. Here's a sentence from The Prince that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it's the most misunderstood line Machiavelli ever wrote. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. He wasn't being cynical about human nature for shock value. He was describing, with almost clinical precision, exactly how social judgment actually works at scale. Think about how few people in your life have ever actually tested your character under real pressure. Your coworkers know you through meetings, emails, and second-hand reputation. Your extended family knows you through holidays and social media. Even close friends mostly know the version of you that you choose to show them. The number of people who have genuinely witnessed your worst moment, your most private failure, or your unfiltered self is vanishingly small compared to the number of people who have formed an opinion of you anyway. This is exactly why reputation management, not actual behavior, is where most power is won or lost. Social psychologist Solomon Ash's classic 1946 studies on impression formation demonstrated something crucial. People don't build impressions of others as a neutral list of traits. A single early trait, warm or cold, competent or incompetent, colors how every subsequent piece of information gets interpreted. This is called the halo effect, and it means the first impression you create isn't just one data point among many. It's the lens through which every future data point gets filtered. Politicians understand this instinctively, which is why image consultants exist as a serious, well-funded profession. Ronald Reagan, one of the most image-conscious American presidents in history, was famously coached extensively on posture, camera angles, and even which side of his face to present, because his team understood, correctly, that voters would form judgments about competence and trustworthiness from 30 seconds of visual impression long before they ever read a single policy paper. The policy might matter for governing. The appearance is what won the election that made governing possible in the first place. Here's where this gets practically useful for you. In your actual daily life, you do not need to become fake or dishonest to use this rule. You need to become intentional about which version of yourself reaches which audience, at which moment, because leaving that entirely to chance means other people's misreadings, gossip, and half-formed impressions will define you instead. If you walk into a new job disheveled and distracted during your first week because you're genuinely overwhelmed, your competence will be silently discounted for months afterward, regardless of the excellent work you do in week 5. Because the halo effect from that first impression is doing quiet, invisible damage to how every later action gets interpreted. The same logic applies in reverse, and this is the part people miss. Once you understand that appearance drives perception more than substance for the vast majority of your relationships, you also gain compassion for how badly you might be misjudging others based on their appearance alone. Use this rule to manage your own presentation deliberately. Use the awareness of it to resist snap judgments about everyone else. Both halves matter, and the second half is what keeps this rule from turning you into someone who only values surface. Law 8. Create the illusion of choice. People resist things done to them. They rarely resist things they believe they chose. This single distinction is worth more real-world influence than almost any persuasion technique in existence. And it's the engine behind Machiavelli's 8th rule. Machiavelli observed something crucial about Italian city-states in the 16th century. Rulers who conquered by force alone faced constant rebellion because conquered people never stop resenting an outcome imposed on them. But rulers who allowed the conquered population some structure of apparent local choice, a council, a vote on minor matters, a say in local governance even while the larger power remained firmly in the ruler's hands, faced dramatically less unrest. The underlying power hadn't changed at all. The population's psychological relationship to that power had changed completely. This exact mechanism has a well-documented name in modern behavioral science: the illusion of control, first rigorously studied by psychologist Ellen Langer in 1975. Langer found that people who were allowed to choose their own lottery numbers, even though the odds were mathematically identical to being assigned random numbers, valued their tickets far more highly and were far more reluctant to trade them away. The actual probability of winning never changed. Only the subjective sense of agency did, and that subjective sense drove real, measurable behavior. Retailers and negotiators use this constantly, often without customers ever noticing. A salesperson who says, "Would you prefer the blue or the black?" instead of, "Would you like to buy this?" has already skipped the actual decision, whether to buy at all, by offering you a smaller, easier decision to feel ownership over. You feel like you're choosing. You are, in fact, choosing something, just not the thing that actually mattered. This technique, sometimes called the choice of alternatives close, remains a staple of sales training because it consistently outperforms direct asks. You can use this constructively in parenting, management, and negotiation alike, and it's worth noting this is one of the least ethically fraught tools in this book when used honestly. A parent who says, "Do you want to brush your teeth before or after your pajamas?" isn't manipulating a child cruelly. They're giving a child real, bounded agency inside a decision the parent has already made. Teeth will be brushed either way, which reduces power struggles dramatically compared to a flat command. A manager who says, "Would you rather lead the client presentation or handle the technical deep dive?" gets far more genuine buy-in than one who simply assigns tasks, even when both options were pre-selected entirely by the manager based on what actually needs doing. The line that matters ethically is this: legitimate use of this rule offers real options within a decision that was going to happen anyway, giving people genuine agency over the parts that can flex. Illegitimate use manufactures a false sense of choice over something that was never actually negotiable at all, purely to prevent resistance to an outcome someone had no real say in. Machiavelli himself never fully resolved this tension. He cared about outcomes for the ruler, not the psychological well-being of the ruled. You get to care about both. And the version of this rule that builds lasting trust rather than eventual resentment is the one where the choice you're offering is genuinely real. Law 9. Let others underestimate you. Being underestimated feels bad. It also happens to be one of the most reliable strategic advantages available to anyone willing to tolerate the discomfort of it. And Machiavelli knew this from brutal personal experience. When Machiavelli was writing The Prince, he was a nobody by the standards of the powerful men he was trying to reach. A disgraced, exiled former bureaucrat with no army, no wealth, and no formal standing. He had every incentive to overstate his importance. Instead, the book itself is structured as flattery and humility toward Lorenzo de' Medici, presenting Machiavelli as a modest observer offering useful counsel rather than a threat or a rival for influence. This wasn't weakness. It was calculated positioning, because a man who is underestimated is rarely defended against. Sun Tzu, writing in China roughly 2,000 years before Machiavelli, captured the same principle even more explicitly in The Art of War. When capable, feign incapacity. When active, feign inactivity. Two civilizations, separated by continents and centuries, independently arrived at the same conclusion that revealing your full capability invites resistance, competition, and preemptive attack, while appearing less capable than you are, invites complacency in your opponents. And complacency is the single most exploitable state an opponent can be in. There's real experimental psychology behind why underestimation works so well as cover. Research on stereotype and expectation effects, building on work like Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson's famous 1968 Pygmalion in the Classroom studies, shows that once someone forms an expectation about your competence, high or low, they unconsciously filter subsequent evidence to confirm that expectation, and they invest attention and defensive effort in proportion to the threat they believe you pose. Someone who believes you're unthreatening simply stops watching you as closely. That reduced scrutiny is not a small advantage. It's often the entire margin between a plan that works and one that gets blocked before it starts. Boxing offers an unusually clean, well-documented example of this outside politics. Floyd Mayweather Jr., one of the most technically dominant boxers of his era, built much of his early career strategy on deliberately absorbing criticism about being boring or lacking power, allowing opponents and commentators to underestimate his actual defensive genius and fight IQ in favor of judging him on more visible, crude metrics like knockout power. Opponents who prepared for a boring, safe fighter consistently found themselves outmaneuvered by a level of tactical control they hadn't fully respected going in. His record: 50 wins, 0 losses, is difficult to argue with as evidence the strategy worked. Here's the practical version for you. In any new environment, a job, a social group, a negotiation, resist the instinct to immediately prove your full capability. Let people's first assumptions about you skew slightly low. Answer questions accurately, but don't volunteer the full extent of what you know. Watch how people behave around someone they believe is less capable or less threatening than you actually are. They relax. They reveal their real agendas. They underestimate the effort required to compete with or block you. Then, when it matters, let your actual capabilities show through results rather than announcements. The gap between what people expected and what you delivered becomes, itself, a form of leverage nobody saw coming. Law 10. Use flattery as a Trojan horse. Flattery has a terrible reputation, and mostly deserved, because most flattery is clumsy, obvious, and instantly recognized for the transparent manipulation it is. But precise, well-targeted flattery, deployed with real skill, remains one of the most consistently effective tools of influence in recorded history, and understanding exactly why separates the amateurs from people who actually move rooms. Machiavelli devoted an entire law of the prince, Law 23, to warning rulers about flatterers, which tells you how seriously he took the danger of it. His advice was double-edged. A wise ruler should surround himself with advisors willing to speak truth, because a court full of flatterers eventually isolates a leader from reality entirely and leads to catastrophic decisions. But Machiavelli also understood, from watching Italian courts operate for years, that flattery works precisely because almost nobody is genuinely immune to it, including rulers who claim to despise it. The psychological mechanism here is well documented. Robert Cialdini, in his landmark and extensively cited work on influence, identified liking as one of the core drivers of persuasion, and found that flattery increases liking reliably, even when the target consciously suspects the flatterer has an ulterior motive. In a striking 1978 study, Cialdini cites participants rated flatterers more favorably even after being explicitly told the flattery was likely insincere and strategically motivated. Knowing it's flattery doesn't fully inoculate you against its effect. That's what makes it dangerous and useful. The key distinction between amateur and effective flattery is specificity. "You're so smart" is amateur flattery, generic, unfalsifiable, and instantly recognizable as a technique. The way you restructured that proposal to lead with the risk mitigation section instead of the opportunity was smart. Most people would have led with the upside is a different category entirely. It's specific enough to feel like genuine observation rather than manufactured praise, references something the person actually did, and demonstrates that you were paying close attention. This kind of targeted, evidence-based flattery bypasses the skepticism that generic flattery immediately triggers. Here's the Trojan horse mechanism this law is named for. Once someone accepts a specific, credible compliment from you, they unconsciously categorize you as an ally, a person with good judgment, and someone worth listening to further. And that categorization opens the door for your next piece of information or request to be received with far less scrutiny than it would have gotten from a stranger. This is precisely how skilled consultants, salespeople, and political operators build trust quickly enough to influence a decision within a single meeting. The compliment isn't the goal. The credibility and reduced scrutiny it purchases is the goal. Use this carefully, because the ethical line here is thinner than it looks. Genuine, specific, accurate appreciation of someone's real work builds real trust and real relationships. This is simply good manners done well, and the world needs more of it. The manipulation begins the moment the flattery is disconnected from anything true, deployed purely as a lubricant to extract something the person wouldn't otherwise give. Machiavelli's own warning about flatterers applies to you using this technique just as much as it applies to you being targeted by it. The moment you start believing your own manufactured compliments, or surrounding yourself only with people who flatter you back, you've lost the very perceptiveness this whole book is trying to sharpen. Law 11. Reframe every failure as someone else's fault. I want to be careful with this one, because it sits closer to the ethical edge of this book than almost any other rule, and I'd rather you understand it fully than use it carelessly. Machiavelli observed something politically uncomfortable but empirically consistent. Rulers who were seen as personally responsible for unpopular or harsh decisions lost public support quickly, while rulers who successfully attributed the same harsh outcomes to advisors, circumstances, or predecessors retained public trust, even while the underlying suffering continued unchanged. This is the exact mechanism behind the Cesare Borgia and Ramiro de Orco episode from Law 1. Cesare didn't merely delegate the harsh governance. He later publicly executed the delegate, specifically, so the cruelty could be blamed on someone else, while Cesare himself was credited with delivering justice. Modern political science calls a version of this blame avoidance, extensively studied by scholars like R. Kent Weaver, whose foundational 1986 research demonstrated that politicians are frequently more motivated by avoiding blame for bad outcomes than by claiming credit for good ones, because the psychological and electoral cost of visible blame is measurably larger than the benefit of visible credit. Entire government structures, including the deliberate use of independent commissions and advisory panels, are sometimes designed less to improve decisions and more to diffuse responsibility for decisions that were going to be unpopular, regardless of who made them. You've seen the corporate version of this constantly. A company raises prices and blames market conditions or supply chain challenges rather than the pricing decisions its own executives made. A manager who assigned an unrealistic deadline blames resourcing constraints from leadership rather than their own planning. This isn't always cynical. Sometimes the diffuse cause genuinely is complex and multifactored. But the pattern of who gets named as the cause and who doesn't rarely tracks perfectly with actual causal responsibility. It tracks with who has the power to control the narrative. Here's where I want to draw the line clearly, more clearly than Machiavelli himself bothered to. Chronic, dishonest blame shifting destroys trust permanently once discovered, and it usually is discovered. People are far better at detecting patterns of dishonesty over time than they are at catching any single instance of it. Colleagues, partners, and teams that experience repeated, unearned blame shifting from someone eventually stop trusting that person's account of anything, which is a catastrophic, often irreversible loss of the very credibility this whole book is about building. Used chronically, this rule doesn't make you powerful. It makes you someone nobody wants in the room when something goes wrong, which is precisely the opposite of power. The legitimate, sustainable version of this rule is narrower and more honest. It's the discipline of not reflexively absorbing blame for outcomes that were genuinely caused by factors outside your control, simply because absorbing blame feels humble or conflict avoidant in the moment. If a project failed because a stakeholder withheld critical information until the deadline, the accurate account of that failure includes the stakeholder's role. Leaving it out to seem gracious isn't virtue, it's inaccurate. And it teaches everyone around you that outcomes are disconnected from actual causes. Use this rule for accuracy under pressure, not for permanent narrative control at the expense of truth. The version of you that survives scrutiny over years, not just in a single meeting, is the version that tells the accurate story even when it's uncomfortable. And that accurate story told consistently becomes its own form of unshakable credibility that no amount of clever blame-shifting could ever purchase. Law 12. Control the narrative before the facts arrive. Whoever tells the story first usually owns it, regardless of how the facts eventually sort themselves out. This is uncomfortable to accept if you believe truth is self-evident and will simply win out over time. It usually doesn't, not without help, and not quickly enough to prevent real damage. Machiavelli's diplomatic career gave him a front-row seat to how quickly a first impression, once established, becomes almost impossible to fully dislodge, even with contradicting evidence arriving later. He observed that a prince's reputation, once set by an early decisive action or an early damaging rumor, tended to calcify. Later, more accurate information rarely traveled as fast or as widely as the original impression, and most observers simply didn't have the time or motivation to update their initial judgment, even when better information became available. Modern research on misinformation confirms this with disturbing precision. A widely cited 2018 MIT study by Soroush Vosuchi, Deb Roy, and Sinan Aral, analyzing roughly 126 citizen stories spreading on Twitter over more than a decade, found that false stories were 70% more likely to be retweeted than true ones, and reached their first 500 people roughly 6 times faster than accurate stories did. The mechanism wasn't bots. It was human psychology, specifically our attraction to novelty and emotional intensity, both of which unconstrained first accounts tend to have in abundance compared to careful, corrected follow-ups. This has an obvious and important defensive application, and an equally obvious offensive one, and you need both. Defensively, if you know a difficult situation is coming, a layoff, a mistake, a conflict that will eventually become known, the version of events that reaches people first will shape how every subsequent piece of information gets received, exactly as the halo effect from Law 7 predicted. Crisis communications professionals live by a simple, brutal rule. You want to be the first source of bad news about yourself, not the last, because self-disclosure reads as honesty and control, while news that arrives from someone else first reads as concealment, regardless of the actual facts. Johnson & Johnson's handling of the 1982 Tylenol cyanide poisoning crisis remains the textbook case taught in business schools, precisely because they got the sequencing right. Rather than waiting for investigators or media to control the story, the company moved immediately and publicly, pulling 31 million bottles of product from shelves nationwide and communicating directly and repeatedly with the public before speculation could fill that vacuum. Their market share, which analysts predicted would be destroyed permanently, recovered within a year, largely because they had authored the narrative of responsible, transparent action before anyone else could author a narrative of corporate negligence for them. The offensive application requires more caution, and I'll be direct about the ethical line. Strategically getting ahead of a true, difficult story about yourself is legitimate crisis management. Manufacturing a false first narrative to preempt an accurate one that would reflect badly on you is simply lying with better timing, and it carries the same risks as any lie, namely, that if it's ever exposed as false, the damage compounds because now you're guilty of both the original issue and the deception about it. Use this rule to be fast and honest, not fast and false. Speed is the actual weapon here. Dishonesty just borrows time you'll eventually have to pay back with interest. Law 13. Cultivate a reputation that works, even when you're absent. The most efficient form of power isn't power you have to exercise personally. It's power that operates on your behalf, even when you're not in the room. A reputation so well established that people regulate their own behavior around you, without you ever needing to intervene. Machiavelli's most famous, most controversial illustration of this principle involves Cesare Borgia's broader campaign of consolidation, where a handful of decisive, visible acts of severity early in his rule created a reputation for ruthlessness that discouraged rebellion for years afterward without requiring anything close to continuous force. Machiavelli's blunt conclusion in Law 17 of The Prince, cruelty used well, meaning applied decisively, rarely, and then stopped, ultimately produces less total suffering and more stability than leniency that has to be repeatedly and unpredictably enforced. Because people organize their behavior around a well-understood reputation far more reliably than around inconsistent, case-by-case responses. This principle scales down remarkably well from empires to ordinary institutions, and the modern evidence for it is strong. Game theorists studying deterrence, building on Thomas Schelling's Nobel Prize-winning work on the strategy of conflict in the 1960s, established that a credible reputation for retaliation prevents far more conflicts than actual retaliation itself ever resolves. Because rational actors avoid testing a reputation they believe is real, while they will repeatedly test a reputation they suspect is bluff. The deterrent value of a reputation is almost entirely front-loaded into whether people believe it's real, not in how often it's actually enforced. You've experienced a benign, everyday version of this if you've ever worked with a manager known for reading every line of every deliverable closely. Employees under that manager submit more careful work, not necessarily because that manager catches every single error personally. Often they don't have time to review everything as thoroughly as their reputation suggests, but because the reputation itself does the enforcement work, causing people to self-regulate before submission. Compare that to a manager known for never really checking work closely. Quality on that team drifts downward over time, not from malice, but because the absence of a reputation for scrutiny removes the self-regulating pressure entirely. Building this kind of reputation deliberately requires patience, because reputations are built from a small number of highly visible, highly consistent data points, rather than from constant activity. One or two moments where you demonstrably followed through on a stated consequence. You said a missed deadline would affect the relationship, and when it happened, it genuinely did. Teach everyone around you far more about what to expect from you than 100 routine interactions where nothing was ever tested. Consistency at the moments that matter most is what reputations are actually built from. Everything else is just background noise that reputation later gets applied to. The trap to avoid is the same one that eventually destroyed several of the Italian rulers Machiavelli studied. A reputation for severity that isn't backed by real willingness to follow through eventually gets tested and exposed as bluff, and once exposed, it collapses completely and permanently. Worse than never having built the reputation at all, because now people know specifically that your threats are empty. Build your reputation on things you are genuinely willing to enforce, state them rarely, and follow through without exception when tested. That combination, more than any single dramatic act, is what makes a reputation do your work for you, even in rooms you'll never personally enter. Part 3. The Architecture of Loyalty and Fear. Law 14. Fear outlasts love, but combine both when you can. This is the rule that made Machiavelli infamous, so let's deal with it directly instead of dancing around it. In Law 17 of The Prince, Machiavelli asks whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared, and answers with brutal clarity. It is much safer to be feared than loved if one of the two has to be wanting. His reasoning wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a cold assessment of reliability. Love, he observed, depends entirely on the other person's continued goodwill, which can evaporate the moment their interests shift. Fear, properly maintained, depends on you, which makes it a far more stable foundation for influence, precisely because it doesn't require anyone else's cooperation to sustain. But, and this is the part most summaries of Machiavelli conveniently skip, he immediately qualifies this with an equally important warning. A ruler must avoid being hated because hatred, unlike mere fear, actively motivates people to conspire against you and actively celebrate your downfall. The distinction between feared but respected and hated is the entire game, and modern organizational psychology backs this up precisely. Research on leadership effectiveness, including work summarized by Amy Cuddy, Susan Fiske, and Peter Glick on the warmth and competence model of social judgment, consistently finds that the most effective and most durable leaders are perceived as high on both dimensions simultaneously, respected for competence and standards, which produces a version of fear, in Machiavelli's sense, meaning people take you seriously and don't test your boundaries carelessly, while also perceived as fundamentally fair, which prevents the corrosive resentment that turns fear into hatred. Consider the sharply different legacies of two demanding, exacting leaders in recent business history. Steve Jobs was famously, sometimes brutally, demanding, known for public criticism of work he considered mediocre, and colleagues who worked under him described genuine fear of disappointing him. Yet Apple's culture under Jobs, documented extensively in Walter Isaacson's biography, remained one employees fought to stay in because the standard was perceived as fair and consistently applied in service of something people believed in: excellent products. Compare this to leaders remembered chiefly for arbitrary, inconsistent cruelty, where the same intensity produced turnover, sabotage, and reputational collapse rather than loyalty. The intensity was similar. The perceived fairness was not, and that single variable determined whether fear stayed useful or curdled into hatred. Here's how to apply this without becoming the kind of person people quietly plot against. Set standards clearly and hold them consistently. This produces the healthy version of fear, which is really just other people's genuine respect for the fact that you mean what you say and won't quietly accept substandard treatment. Never let that firmness slide into personal cruelty, humiliation, or inconsistency, because those specific behaviors are what convert respect into hatred, and hatred is what gets people removed from power far more reliably than mere firmness ever does. Combine this consistent firmness with genuine warmth wherever you can afford it. Checking in on people, acknowledging real effort, being generous when generosity costs you little. Machiavelli was right that love alone is a fragile foundation. He was equally right, if less quoted on this point, that fear without any warmth is a countdown to being overthrown. Law 15, reward publicly, punish privately, or vice versa, strategically. The way you deliver praise and criticism is often more consequential than the content of either, and almost nobody thinks about this deliberately. Most people simply react to good and bad performance in the moment, without considering what the delivery itself communicates to everyone watching. Machiavelli's practical political advice touched on this indirectly through his broader discussion of how rulers manage the perceptions of those around them. A punishment delivered privately allows the ruler to maintain a relationship with the punished party while still correcting behavior, whereas a punishment delivered publicly sends a broader signal to everyone watching about where the boundaries lie. A signal that can be worth far more than the correction of any single individual's behavior. Modern management research has actually reversed the folk wisdom on this in an interesting way. The classic advice, praise publicly, criticize privately, remains broadly correct for most day-to-day management, and there's good reason for it. Public criticism triggers what social psychologists call an audience effect, where the target's primary concern shifts from correcting the behavior to managing the social humiliation of the moment, which paradoxically makes people defensive and less receptive to actually improving. A 1996 study on feedback interventions by Avraham Kluger and Angelo Denisi, reviewing over 600 studies, found that roughly a third of feedback interventions actually decreased performance, and public, ego-threatening delivery was a major contributing factor in those failures. But Machiavelli's sharper insight, the one that goes beyond conventional management advice, is that the choice of public versus private isn't just about being kind to the individual. It's a strategic decision about what signal you want the wider group to receive. There are moments where a public correction, handled with precision rather than humiliation, serves an important function. It demonstrates to an entire team that a specific behavior genuinely has consequences, which private corrections cannot do, because private corrections are invisible to everyone except the two people involved. A manager who only ever corrects behavior privately may be individually kind, while allowing an entire team to remain uncertain about where real boundaries actually lie, because nobody besides the corrected individual ever sees evidence that boundaries are enforced at all. The reverse logic applies with equal force to rewards. Public recognition of good work does more than reward the individual. It teaches the entire group, through a concrete example, exactly what behavior gets valued and elevated, which is a far more effective teaching tool than any written policy or stated value. This is precisely why well-run organizations invest real resources in visible recognition systems, not out of sentimentality, but because a single well-publicized example of rewarded behavior shapes dozens of other people's choices going forward, at a fraction of the cost of managing each of those choices individually. The strategic version of this rule, then, isn't a fixed formula. It's a live question you should ask before every single instance of praise or correction. What does this specific individual need in this moment? And separately, what does everyone else watching need to learn from how I handle it? Sometimes those two answers point toward the same delivery method. Often they don't, and when they conflict, the decision about which one to prioritize is itself a real exercise of judgment and power. One Machiavelli would tell you to make consciously, rather than defaulting to whatever delivery method simply feels most comfortable to you personally in the moment. Law 16. Keep allies close but never equal. There's a particular kind of alliance that feels warm and stable right up until the moment it becomes your biggest liability, and Machiavelli spent considerable energy in The Prince warning against exactly this trap. Forming alliances with parties who are, or could become, powerful enough to threaten you if their interests ever diverged from yours. His specific advice was that a prince should never help make another power stronger than himself, because that stronger power, once created, has no further need of the prince's goodwill and every incentive to eventually act on its own interest rather than the original alliance's terms. He illustrated this with the Venetians, who helped the French King Louis XII gain a foothold in Italy in 1499, expecting to share in the resulting territory, only to find that once Louis's position was secure, he had far less need of Venetian cooperation, and their leverage in the relationship had evaporated almost entirely. This dynamic has a precise name in modern political science and organizational theory. It's a version of what's studied as power asymmetry in alliance stability research. Political scientists studying coalition durability, including work stemming from William Riker's foundational 1962 theory of political coalitions, find that alliances between roughly equal partners tend to be more stable and more genuinely reciprocal than alliances where one party helps the other grow disproportionately more powerful, because equal partners retain roughly symmetric leverage over the relationship's continuation, while asymmetric partners eventually find themselves unable to enforce the original terms of the deal once the power gap widens. You've likely seen a version of this in business partnerships and even friendships. A startup founder brings on an early, less experienced partner as an equal co-founder and pours enormous energy into building that partner's skills and network alongside the company, only to find, once the partner has genuinely grown into an independently valuable, marketable figure in their own right, that the partner has considerably less need of the original founder's goodwill than they once did. And the balance of the relationship shifts in ways the original founder never anticipated when the help was being given generously and without much strategic thought. This doesn't mean you should refuse to help people around you grow. And Machiavelli's advice here needs real tempering. An alliance strategy built entirely on keeping everyone weaker than yourself is both ethically corrosive and, practically, self-defeating, because genuinely talented people eventually notice when they're being deliberately held back, and they leave for environments where their growth isn't treated as a threat. The useful, more sustainable version of this rule is narrower. Be thoughtful about which relationships you invest in disproportionately, and be honest with yourself about whether a given ally's growing power and independence is likely to remain aligned with your interests once they no longer need you, or whether it's likely to diverge. The healthiest version of this principle, practically applied, is to diversify your alliances rather than depending heavily on any single one, so that no individual relationship's eventual shift in power balance can genuinely threaten your position. Build several moderately strong relationships rather than one enormously strong one that could, if it turned, take everything down with it. And when you do help someone grow significantly, do it because the relationship is built on more than pure transactional dependency. Because shared values, demonstrated integrity over time, and real personal trust are the things that keep an alliance intact, even after the original power imbalance that created it has disappeared. Machiavelli was writing about city-states with no real mechanism for trust beyond raw interest. You have more tools available than he did. Use them. Law 17. Create dependency, not just gratitude. Gratitude fades. It fades faster than almost anyone wants to admit. And Machiavelli understood this well enough to build an entire strategic principle around the difference between a favor that produces temporary gratitude and a structural arrangement that produces ongoing dependency. He observed, across the many Italian rulers whose rises and falls he studied closely, that leaders who relied on people's gratitude for past favors consistently found that gratitude alone provided weak, unreliable loyalty over time. Because gratitude is a backward-looking emotion, tied to a past event that recedes in psychological weight with each passing month, while people's present circumstances and present incentives exert a far stronger pull on their actual behavior than memory of a past kindness does. This finding is strongly supported by modern research on reciprocity. Social psychologist Dennis Regan's classic 1971 experiments on the reciprocity norm found that people do feel a genuine, measurable obligation to return a favor, but that obligation weakens substantially over time and distance, and is easily overridden by present, competing interests once enough time has passed. A single favor creates a temporary debt in someone's mind. It does not create a lasting structural relationship, and treating the two as equivalent is one of the most common strategic mistakes people make when trying to build loyalty. Dependency operates by an entirely different, far more durable mechanism, because it's tied to someone's present and ongoing needs rather than to a memory. Consider how effectively subscription-based businesses have restructured entire industries around exactly this insight. Software companies moved decisively away from one-time purchases towards subscription models, over the past 2 decades, not merely for smoother revenue, though that mattered, but because a customer who has built their workflow, their data, and their daily habits around a specific platform experiences genuine switching costs that a one-time buyer never does. That customer isn't loyal out of gratitude for a good purchase experience years ago. They're loyal in the more durable behavioral sense, because leaving now carries a real current cost. The same principle explains why the most enduring professional relationships tend to be built on ongoing mutual usefulness, rather than a single memorable favor. A mentor who does one impressive thing for you early in your career earns real, warm gratitude, but a mentor who remains genuinely useful to your ongoing decisions, someone whose counsel you actually still need on live problems years later, earns a far more durable form of loyalty, because the relationship is structurally embedded in your present functioning rather than resting entirely on a fond memory of the past. Here's the ethical distinction that matters enormously in how you apply this rule. Manufacturing artificial dependency, deliberately withholding skills, information, or independence from someone specifically to keep them reliant on you against their own genuine interest, is corrosive, exploitative, and it's the version of this rule that turns relationships into something closer to captivity than partnership. The legitimate, sustainable version is different. It's the discipline of continuing to be genuinely, actively useful to the people in your orbit, rather than resting on the goodwill generated by past contributions and assuming that goodwill will simply persist on its own. Ongoing value creates ongoing relevance. A single good deed, no matter how generous, creates only a fading echo of gratitude that time and competing interests will eventually erode. Law 18. Isolate before you persuade. Every negotiator, every cult leader, every skilled salesperson, and every abusive partner has at some point independently discovered the same uncomfortable truth. It is dramatically easier to change someone's mind when they're separated from the people who would normally challenge that change. This is precisely why Machiavelli's 18th rule sits among the most ethically dangerous in this book, and why I want to spend extra time on the line between its legitimate and illegitimate uses. Machiavelli's own advice touched on a narrower, more defensible version of this principle. Rulers should be cautious about advisors who isolate them from a range of counsel, because isolation from diverse perspectives is precisely what allows flattery, bad information, and self-serving advisors to dominate a ruler's decision-making unchecked. His warning was framed defensively: protect yourself from being isolated, but the same mechanism, understood in reverse, describes exactly how influence over others is most efficiently exercised. Social psychology has documented the offensive version of this mechanism with disturbing clarity, most famously in Solomon Asch's 1951 conformity experiments. Asch found that individuals were dramatically more likely to conform to an obviously incorrect group judgment when surrounded by others giving that incorrect answer, but that the presence of just one other dissenting voice in the room reduced conformity to the wrong answer by roughly 3/4. One outside perspective, one person willing to disagree, was enough to substantially restore an individual's ability to trust their own judgment. Remove that dissenting voice entirely, isolate the person from any outside perspective, and susceptibility to persuasion, manipulation, and groupthink rises sharply. This is precisely the mechanism that documented coercive control in abusive relationships exploits, and I want to name this directly rather than dance around it, because recognizing this pattern in your own life or a loved one's life matters more than almost anything else in this book. Domestic violence researchers, including foundational work by Evan Stark on coercive control, have documented a highly consistent pattern. Abusers systematically work to separate victims from friends, family, and financial independence. Not necessarily all at once, but gradually, often framed as concern, jealousy born from love, or simple preference for spending time together. Specifically because an isolated victim has no outside perspective available to challenge the abuser's version of reality, and no independent resources available to leave. High-control groups and cults use an identical structural mechanism, extensively documented by psychologist Robert Cialdini and cult researchers like Stephen Hassan. New members are gradually separated from outside relationships and outside sources of information, replacing them with an intense, all-consuming community that becomes the members' only source of social validation and information, at which point the group's version of reality becomes extremely difficult to challenge from within, because there's no longer an within that includes any outside perspective. I'm including this rule not to teach you to isolate people, and I want to be unambiguous about that. I'm including it so you can recognize the pattern instantly, in yourself and in others, because it is one of the most dangerous mechanisms of control that exists, and it operates gradually enough that victims frequently don't recognize it happening until their outside support network has already substantially eroded. If you notice someone in your life, a partner, a friend, a family member, gradually discouraging your other relationships, expressing frustration when you seek outside perspectives, or positioning themselves as your only trustworthy source of information or support, treat that pattern as a serious warning sign, not a sign of unusually intense devotion. And if you ever notice yourself doing this to someone else, even with affectionate intentions, stop immediately and examine why controlling someone else's access to outside perspective feels necessary to you at all. Law 19. Never let anyone see the machinery behind the curtain. There's a particular kind of authority that evaporates the instant people understand exactly how it works. And there's a different, more durable kind of authority that survives full transparency because it's built on something real. Machiavelli's 19th rule is about protecting the former while you work toward building the latter. Machiavelli's own writing on religious and ceremonial authority is instructive here, even though he wrote about it somewhat obliquely. He observed that rulers who successfully associated themselves with something larger than mere personal ambition, divine sanction, tradition, ceremony, ritual, commanded a kind of obedience that purely personal transactional authority never could, because people don't just obey a ceremony, they participate in believing in it. And that belief does far more enforcement work than fear of punishment alone ever could. The moment the mechanism behind a ceremony becomes visible, the moment people can see it as a deliberately constructed tool rather than something with independent, inherent authority, its power collapses, often permanently, because you cannot unsee a mechanism once you've seen it clearly. The Wizard of Oz gives us the cultural shorthand for this entire principle, but the sociological reality behind it is well documented and considerably older than the story. Sociologist Irving Goffman's landmark 1959 work on impression management, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, drew an explicit distinction between the front stage, where a performance of competence, authority, or role is deliberately presented to an audience, and the backstage, where the actual, messier preparation and uncertainty happens away from that audience's view. Goffman's crucial insight was that virtually all social authority, a doctor's, a judge's, a teacher's, a manager's, depends on maintaining a clean separation between these two spaces, and that authority visibly damaged whenever an audience gets an unintended glimpse backstage, even when nothing they see there is actually disqualifying. This is exactly why surgeons don't visibly panic in front of patients, even during genuine uncertainty, Why judges maintain formal robes and elevated benches designed explicitly to visually separate them from the ordinary proceedings below, and why competent managers rarely let their team witness their own private moments of doubt about a major decision, even when some doubt is completely reasonable and even healthy to have. It's not dishonesty. It's the recognition that certain kinds of functional authority depend on a controlled, consistent presentation, and that presentation genuinely serves the people relying on that authority. A patient mid-surgery is not well served by watching their surgeon's private uncertainty in real time, even if that uncertainty is medically appropriate and will be resolved through careful, competent decision-making moments later. The line Machiavelli's rule pushes right up against, and sometimes crosses, is the difference between protecting a functional, earned authority's presentation and actively deceiving people about whether that authority is earned at all. A surgeon maintaining calm composure during a genuinely difficult but ultimately well-managed procedure is legitimate impression management protecting real competence. A person maintaining an elaborate front of expertise or authority they simply do not possess, specifically to extract trust, compliance, or resources they haven't earned, is fraud, regardless of how skillfully the front is constructed. Use this rule to protect the presentation of competence and judgment you've genuinely built through real preparation and real capability. Never use it to manufacture the appearance of capability that doesn't actually exist underneath, because that particular gap between manufactured appearance and absent substance is precisely the gap that eventually collapses catastrophically, usually at the worst possible moment, when the machinery finally does get seen. Law 20. Turn rivals into instruments without their knowledge. The most efficient way to neutralize a rival isn't to defeat them directly. It's to redirect their energy towards serving your goals without them ever realizing that's what's happening. This is one of the more genuinely uncomfortable rules in this book, and I want to walk through exactly how it works before discussing where the ethical line actually sits. Machiavelli's clearest illustration of this comes from his account of how skilled rulers handled rival factions within their own territories. Rather than attempting to suppress every rival faction directly, which invites constant, exhausting conflict, the more efficient rulers he studied learned to set rival factions against each other, or to channel a rival's ambition toward a goal that happened to also serve the ruler's own interests, allowing the rival's own energy and resources to accomplish something useful without that rival ever fully recognizing whose agenda was actually being advanced. This mechanism has a well-documented modern name in organizational strategy. It's related to what's sometimes called co-optation, a concept formalized by sociologist Philip Selznick in his influential 1949 study of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Selznick found that organizations facing potential opposition frequently neutralize that opposition most effectively not by fighting it directly, but by absorbing potential critics into the organization's own structure, giving them a formal role, a title, a seat at the table, which had the effect of making the former critic partially responsible for the organization's success, and therefore considerably less likely to attack it as forcefully as they might have from the outside. You've likely witnessed a workplace version of this, whether or not you recognize the mechanism at the time. A manager facing a talented, ambitious subordinate who represents a genuine competitive threat to the manager's own position has a choice. Fight that subordinates rise directly, which risks an ugly, visible conflict the manager might not win, or instead assign that subordinate to lead a genuinely important, visible project, one that channels their ambition into something the manager can credibly claim partial credit for, while also keeping that rising star's energy focused on execution rather than on political maneuvering against the manager. The subordinate gets real opportunity and real growth. The manager gets a rival's substantial talent and energy redirected into something that serves the manager's own standing. Both parties can honestly describe the arrangement as a genuine opportunity, which is precisely what makes it effective. It isn't purely cynical, even though it's also strategic. Here's where this rule requires real ethical care, more than almost any other in this book. There's a meaningful difference between redirecting a rival's energy toward a genuinely mutually beneficial arrangement. The subordinate example above involves real opportunity, real growth, and real value received by both sides, and secretly manipulating someone into unknowingly working against their own actual interests purely for your benefit, which is a considerably darker application of the same underlying mechanism. Machiavelli, writing for princes concerned only with holding power, doesn't draw this distinction sharply. You should. The version of this rule worth actually practicing is this: when you identify a rival or a potential competitor, resist the reflexive urge toward direct confrontation, which is often the most costly and least certain path available. Instead, look for a genuine point of overlapping interest, some outcome that would authentically benefit both of you, even if unequally, and propose or create the structure that channels both of your energy toward it. This isn't deception if the benefit to the other party is real and honestly presented. It becomes deception and crosses into the territory this book asks you to avoid, only when the other party's stated benefit is a fiction designed purely to extract their effort for your exclusive gain. The mechanism is identical in both cases. The honesty of what you're offering in return is the entire difference. Part 4. Offense, Defense, and the Long Game. Law 21. Strike fast when you strike at all. Half measures are, in Machiavelli's clear-eyed assessment, almost always worse than either full restraint or full decisive action, because a half measure gives an opponent enough warning to defend or retaliate without actually resolving the underlying conflict. This is the logic behind one of his most quoted and most misunderstood passages. In Law 8 of the Prince, discussing the Sicilian ruler Agathocles, Machiavelli lays out a principle he calls the difference between cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. Cruelty well used, in his framework, is applied decisively, all at once at the outset, and then stopped entirely, allowing the ruler to move on to building genuine goodwill afterward. Cruelty badly used is applied gradually, in a drip feed of ongoing small punishments that never fully resolve the underlying threat while continuously reminding everyone of the ruler's harshness, generating cumulative resentment without ever purchasing the stability that decisive action would have. His conclusion was blunt. Injuries, if they must be done at all, should be done all at once, so that being tasted less, they offend less, while benefits should be handed out slowly, so that they can be savored longer. This principle maps cleanly onto well-documented findings in modern organizational change management. Research on layoffs and organizational restructuring, including work summarized by management scholars studying surgical versus drawn-out downsizing, consistently finds that companies which conduct a single, decisive round of difficult cuts recover morale and productivity among remaining employees considerably faster than companies that conduct the same total headcount reduction through multiple rounds spread over many months. The repeated rounds don't reduce the total pain. They multiply the total duration of anxiety and eroded trust among survivors, who spend each intervening month bracing for the next round, rather than rebuilding genuine engagement with their work. There's a clear psychological mechanism behind why gradual bad news causes more cumulative suffering than a single decisive dose of the same total bad news. and it's related to what behavioral economists call the peak-end rule, documented extensively by Daniel Kahneman and colleagues in the 1990s. People's memory and emotional experience of an unpleasant episode is disproportionately shaped by its most intense moment and by how it ends, not by its total duration. A single, intense, clearly bounded difficult conversation, painful as it is, ends, allowing genuine recovery to begin. A series of smaller, drawn-out difficult conversations never fully ends, and the ongoing uncertainty itself becomes a chronic, low-grade stressor that produces more total suffering than the concentrated version would have. Here's the practical application, in contexts far more ordinary than princely conquest. If a difficult conversation needs to happen, ending a relationship that isn't working, delivering a hard piece of feedback, making an unpopular but necessary decision, resist the instinct to soften it through a series of smaller hints and partial disclosures spread across weeks, an approach that feels kinder in each individual moment, but that actually extends and multiplies the other person's total anxiety and uncertainty. Deliver the full, clear message once, with real care in how it's delivered, and then commit fully to helping the other person move forward from a clear, complete understanding of where things stand. The kindness isn't in avoiding the hard moment. It's in not making them live through an extended, uncertain version of it, multiple times when one clear, complete conversation would have resolved it entirely. Law 22. Sacrifice a pawn to save the king. Every serious chess player learns this principle in their first months of study, and it applies with equal force well beyond the chessboard. Refusing to sacrifice anything, ever, in defense of your most important priorities is not caution. It's a strategic failure that eventually costs you far more than the sacrifice would have. Machiavelli's version of this principle runs throughout his analysis of successful versus unsuccessful rulers. The ones who survived crises were consistently willing to give up a lesser position, a lesser ally, or a lesser piece of territory in order to preserve their core strength, while the ones who insisted on defending every single position equally, refusing to concede anything, frequently lost everything, because spreading finite resources evenly across all fronts left no front adequately defended when a real threat concentrated its force against any single point. This is formally studied in game theory and military strategy as the principle of concentration of force, tracing back to Karl von Clausewitz's foundational 19th-century military theory, and it has a precise, well-documented modern parallel in how successful organizations navigate genuine crises. When a company faces a serious financial crisis, the executives who successfully navigate it are consistently the ones willing to make an early, decisive, painful cut to a genuinely lower priority division or product line, sacrificing that pawn in order to preserve enough capital and organizational focus to protect the core business. The executives who instead try to preserve every division equally, spreading the same shrinking resources thin across all of them, frequently end up losing the entire company because no single part of it ever received the concentrated resources needed to actually survive the crisis. Kodak's well-documented collapse in the face of digital photography offers a sobering real-world illustration of the failure to apply this principle correctly. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera in 1975. Engineer Stephen Sassen's prototype is well documented in company records and subsequent retrospectives. But the company's leadership, unwilling to sacrifice its enormously profitable film business, even partially in favor of the emerging digital pawn, spent decades trying to protect both simultaneously. By the time Kodak committed seriously to digital, competitors who had made the sacrifice earlier had already captured the market, and Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2012. The company's failure wasn't a failure of innovation. They had the technology first, It was a failure of willingness to sacrifice a valuable, currently profitable position in service of a longer term, more important one. The emotional difficulty here is real and worth naming honestly. Sacrificing something valuable feels like failure in the moment, even when it's the strategically correct move, and this emotional discomfort is precisely why so many people and organizations avoid making necessary sacrifices until circumstances force the decision anyway, usually under far worse conditions and with far fewer good options than an earlier, voluntary sacrifice would have preserved. The practical discipline this rule asks of you is uncomfortable but valuable. Periodically and honestly identify which of your current commitments, relationships, or projects are genuinely your king, the thing whose loss would be catastrophic and irreversible, and which are pawns, valuable but ultimately replaceable if circumstances demanded their sacrifice. Most people never do this exercise consciously, which means when a real crisis eventually forces a choice, they're making it under maximum stress with no prior clarity about their own priorities. Do the exercise now, while you have the calm to think clearly, so that if a genuine crisis ever does force a sacrifice, you'll already know which pieces you can afford to lose in service of protecting what actually matters most. Law 23. Let others take credit while you take control. There's a specific, counterintuitive form of power that comes from deliberately declining visible credit in favor of retaining actual decision-making control. And it's one of the least understood rules in this entire book precisely because it runs directly against most people's instinct to seek recognition. Machiavelli observed that visible credit and actual power frequently pull against each other rather than reinforcing each other, because visible credit attracts scrutiny, envy, and active opposition from rivals who resent being outshone, while actual, quiet control over outcomes attracts far less resistance precisely because it's less visible and therefore less threatening to challenge. A ruler who allowed a talented general to receive public glory for a military victory, while the ruler retained actual strategic control over that general's deployment and resources, often preserved power more effectively than a ruler who insisted on personally claiming every victory and therefore personally absorbed every rival's resentment and every subsequent challenge to that claimed glory. This principle has strong support in modern research on organizational influence, particularly work on what's sometimes called quiet power or informal authority. Sociological research on organizational networks, including foundational work by Ronald Burt on structural holes in social networks, demonstrates that individuals who occupy a bridging position between different groups, controlling the flow of information and resources between them without necessarily holding the most visible formal title, frequently exercise more genuine influence over outcomes than the formally credited leaders those bridging individuals quietly support, precisely because their influence isn't visible enough to attract the resistance that visible authority typically generates. Consider how many of history's most consequential political and business decisions were substantially shaped by advisors, chiefs of staff, and behind-the-scenes strategists whose names most people can't recall, while the visible leaders they served received both the credit and, crucially, the accountability and vulnerability that comes attached to visible credit. This isn't a coincidence or an oversight of history. It's frequently a deliberate strategic choice by the people operating with real influence from behind the visible position, because visible credit comes bundled with visible vulnerability, and many of the most durable power holders throughout history have understood that trade explicitly and chosen control over credit deliberately. There's an important practical nuance here that separates sustainable application of this rule from a version that gets exploited. Deliberately declining credit only works as a power-building strategy if you retain genuine awareness among the small circle of people who actually matter for your longer-term position of your real contribution. Otherwise, you're simply giving away value with nothing retained in return, which is generosity, not strategy. The mechanism only functions if there's an accurate private ledger being kept somewhere, even if it's never publicly stated, so that your actual influence and value compound over time, even while your public visibility stays deliberately modest. The practical version of this rule for your own life. In situations where visible credit would attract more scrutiny, jealousy, or vulnerability than it's actually worth to you, consider deliberately letting a colleague, a partner, or a more visible figure take the public credit for an outcome you substantially shaped, while ensuring that the people who actually matter for your career or your position, your direct manager, your closest professional allies, the people who will eventually decide your next opportunity, have an accurate private understanding of your real contribution. This isn't about being a martyr or being taken advantage of. It's about recognizing that credit and control are two different currencies, and being deliberate about which one you're actually optimizing for in any given situation, rather than defaulting reflexively to chasing visible credit simply because that's the more socially obvious thing to want. Law 24. Anticipate betrayal before it happens. Machiavelli's advice on this point is often summarized crudely as trust no one, which misses the actual sophistication of what he was arguing. His real position was more precise and considerably more useful. Build your plans so that betrayal, if it comes, damages you as little as possible. Not because you assume everyone will betray you, but because assuming no one ever could is a fragile foundation that guarantees catastrophic damage on the rare occasions it turns out to be wrong. He drew this lesson repeatedly from studying rulers who were destroyed specifically because they had structured their power around a single point of failure, one trusted advisor, one crucial alliance, one loyal general, without ever building in redundancy or contingency for the possibility, however unlikely it seemed at the time, that this single point of trust might fail. The rulers who survived long political careers, by contrast, consistently built structures with redundancy, multiple independent sources of information rather than a single trusted advisor, multiple alliances rather than dependence on one, so that the failure or betrayal of any single relationship, however painful, didn't threaten the entire structure of their power. This is precisely the logic behind well-documented risk management principles in fields as varied as finance, engineering, and cybersecurity. And it's worth understanding the formal version because it clarifies exactly what anticipating betrayal actually means in practice. Financial diversification exists for exactly this reason, not because financial advisors assume any specific investment will definitely fail, but because a portfolio built on the reasonable assumption that any single position could fail survives that failure far better than a concentrated portfolio built on the assumption that the single chosen position definitely won't. Redundant systems in aerospace engineering, where critical aircraft functions are deliberately duplicated across multiple independent systems, follow an identical logic. Not because engineers expect any specific system to fail, but because building as though one might fail is what actually prevents catastrophic single-point failures from bringing down the entire aircraft. The psychological version of this principle is harder to practice than the financial or engineering versions, because anticipating betrayal in personal relationships can feel like it contradicts genuine trust and intimacy, and there's real tension here, worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. But the useful distinction is this: Anticipating betrayal doesn't mean withholding genuine emotional investment or genuine vulnerability from the people closest to you. That withholding would make real intimacy impossible and would itself become a kind of self-fulfilling isolation. It means being deliberate about structural dependencies, specifically the kind Law 4 discussed. Not making any single person your only source of a critical resource, a critical piece of information, or a critical form of support, so that if that specific relationship ever does fail, through betrayal, through simple change, through death, through any of the ordinary ways relationships end, you aren't left structurally devastated on top of the genuine emotional pain that loss would understandably cause. Practically, this means maintaining more than one close friendship rather than pouring all your emotional dependency into a single relationship, maintaining professional relationships and skills beyond a single mentor or a single company, and being honest with yourself about which of your current dependencies are structured with this kind of resilience and which aren't. This isn't cynicism about the people in your life. Most relationships never do involve betrayal, and treating every person as a probable future betrayer would be both inaccurate and corrosive to the genuine trust that makes relationships worthwhile in the first place. It's simply the recognition that structural resilience and genuine trust aren't actually in conflict with each other. You can trust people fully while still building a life that wouldn't structurally collapse if that trust, in some rare instance, turned out to be misplaced. Law 25, turn crisis into opportunity instantly. The word crisis derives from the ancient Greek krisis, meaning a turning point or a moment of decision, not, originally, a purely negative event, but a moment where outcomes genuinely diverge based on what happens next. Machiavelli understood this etymology intuitively even without the linguistic history, and it shaped one of his most practically useful rules. The ruler who treats a crisis purely as a threat to survive has already lost half the available advantage compared to the ruler who treats the same crisis as a rare opening for decisive, otherwise impossible action. His reasoning was structural rather than merely optimistic. In stable, ordinary times, existing power structures, existing loyalties, and existing expectations are firmly entrenched, making significant change difficult, regardless of how badly it might be needed. People resist change to a system that's currently working adequately for them, even when a better alternative genuinely exists. A genuine crisis disrupts that entrenchment. Old loyalties become renegotiable, old assumptions become questionable, and people who would normally resist significant change become, often for a narrow window of time, considerably more open to it, simply because the crisis has already destabilized their prior expectations, regardless of what anyone does next. This dynamic is extensively documented in economic history under the concept of creative destruction, formalized by economist Joseph Schumpeter in his influential 1942 work, and repeatedly confirmed by how specific companies have actually navigated major economic disruptions. Consider how Netflix responded to a crisis largely of its own making in 2011, when the company's decision to split its DVD and streaming services into separate pricing plans triggered a customer backlash so severe it lost roughly 800,000 subscribers in a single quarter, and its stock price fell by more than 75% over the following months. Rather than retreating entirely back to its prior model, Netflix's leadership used the disruption as cover for an accelerated, aggressive pivot toward original streaming content production, a strategic shift that might have faced far more internal and market resistance during ordinary, stable conditions, but that the crisis environment made considerably easier to push through decisively. The bet, in hindsight, fundamentally reshaped the entertainment industry. There's a psychological mechanism underlying why crises create these unusual windows for decisive action, and it connects back to the framing research discussed in Law 3. During a crisis, people's normal cognitive processing shifts toward what psychologists studying decision-making under stress call a narrower, more urgency-driven focus. The careful, deliberative, status quo protecting evaluation that governs ordinary decisions gets partially suspended in favor of faster, more decisive processing. This shift can be exploited destructively, and history offers no shortage of examples of leaders using manufactured or genuine crises to push through changes that wouldn't survive careful scrutiny. Which is exactly why this particular rule carries real ethical weight and deserves real caution in how you apply it. The legitimate, constructive version of this rule, the one worth actually practicing, is this: when a genuine crisis arrives in your work or your life, not one you've manufactured, but a real disruption that's already happening regardless of your preference, resist the instinct to spend all your energy purely on damage control and returning to the prior status quo as quickly as possible. Ask, alongside your legitimate crisis response, a second question. Is there a change I've believed was necessary for some time, one that faced real resistance under normal conditions, that this disrupted moment now makes more possible? The crisis is happening either way. Whether you extract only survival from it or extract survival plus a genuine strategic opening is very much a live choice available to you in that specific window, and it closes faster than most people realize once circumstances begin stabilizing back toward the old normal. Law 26. Play the long game while others chase short wins. Most of the power struggles you'll ever witness in your life are won not by the person with the cleverest single move, but by the person operating on a longer time horizon than everyone else at the table, patiently accepting smaller, less satisfying short-term outcomes in exchange for a substantially stronger long-term position. This is arguably the least glamorous of Machiavelli's rules, and also, by most historical accounts, the most consistently decisive one. Machiavelli's own extended analysis in the Discourses on Livy of Rome's rise from a minor city-state to the dominant power of the ancient Mediterranean world credits much of Rome's success not to any single brilliant tactical victory, but to Rome's unusual sustained institutional patience, a willingness to absorb early military defeats, rebuild, and continue pursuing a consistent long-term strategy of alliance building and gradual expansion over generations, while many of Rome's individual rivals, more tactically brilliant in any single engagement, were eventually worn down by Rome's sheer persistence and consistency over a far longer timescale than those rivals were prepared to sustain their own efforts across. Modern behavioral economics offers a precise, well-documented explanation for why long-time horizons provide such a durable structural advantage. Most people, across cultures and contexts, exhibit what's called hyperbolic discounting, a well-established cognitive bias, documented extensively by researchers including George Ainsley and later popularized in behavioral economics more broadly, in which people systematically overvalue smaller, immediate rewards relative to larger, delayed ones, even when the delayed reward is objectively and substantially more valuable on any rational calculation. This isn't a flaw limited to impulsive or undisciplined people. It's a nearly universal feature of human cognition, which means that anyone capable of consistently overriding this bias in their own decision-making gains a real structural advantage over the vast majority of people and organizations who don't. Warren Buffett's investment career offers one of the most extensively documented modern illustrations of this exact principle in action. Buffett's own frequently cited explanation of his success centers not on unusually sophisticated financial analysis. He has repeatedly and publicly insisted his core methods are simple enough for most investors to understand, but on an unusually long time horizon and unusual patience in the face of short-term market pressure that causes most other investors to abandon sound long-term positions during temporary downturns. Berkshire Hathaway's compounding returns over more than 5 decades reflect, by Buffett's own account and by the analysis of virtually every serious student of his career, a strategy whose core advantage was psychological and temporal discipline as much as it was analytical insight. The practical discipline this rule demands of you is genuinely difficult, precisely because hyperbolic discounting isn't a bias you can simply decide to stop having. It operates below the level of conscious deliberation for most people, most of the time. The workaround isn't willpower alone. It's structural. Build systems and commitments in advance during calm moments when your long-term judgment is clearest that make it harder to abandon a sound long-term strategy during the inevitable moments of short-term pressure or temptation that will test it later. This might mean an explicit, written-down set of criteria for a career decision decided before you're actually facing the tempting short-term alternative. It might mean automatic financial contributions that don't require an active, temptable decision each month. Whatever the specific mechanism, the underlying principle Machiavelli identified 5 centuries ago remains exactly as true now as it was in Renaissance Italy. The people and institutions capable of consistently outlasting their own short-term impulses and outlasting rivals who can't do the same accumulate a compounding structural advantage that no single clever tactical move can ever fully replicate. Part 5. Mastery and Restraint. Law 27. Know when not to use power. Every rule in this book so far has been about acquiring, protecting, or exercising influence and control. This law exists because the most sophisticated practitioners of power throughout history, the ones who held it longest and lost it least catastrophically, all eventually learned a harder, less intuitive skill. Recognizing the specific moments when the correct move is to deliberately not use the leverage available to you, even though you could. Machiavelli himself, for all his reputation as an advocate of ruthlessness, was more nuanced on this point than popular summaries suggest. His broader argument throughout The Prince wasn't that cruelty, deception, and force should be used constantly. It was that a ruler needs the capacity for these things available when genuinely necessary, while generally governing through more conventional, less costly means the rest of the time. A ruler who used harsh measures constantly, he observed, exhausted the population's tolerance and burned through the very reputation for restraint that made harsh measures effective, precisely because they were rare and therefore meaningful when actually deployed. There's a clear, well-documented parallel in modern research on deterrence and coercive power. Studies of workplace authority consistently find that managers who use their formal power to overrule or discipline subordinates constantly, even when technically justified in each individual instance, generate cumulatively worse team performance and higher turnover than managers who reserve that formal power for genuinely necessary moments, relying the rest of the time on collaboration, persuasion, and delegated autonomy. The formal power doesn't disappear when used sparingly. Its effectiveness in the moments it actually gets deployed increases, precisely because it hasn't been devalued through overuse. This connects directly back to the reputation principle from Law 13, where a threat used constantly loses its deterrent weight, while one reserved for real necessity retains full force. There's also a deeper, more personal reason to master restraint that goes beyond pure strategic calculation. The capacity to hold real leverage over someone, genuine knowledge of their weakness, genuine structural power over their circumstances. and to consciously choose not to exercise that leverage when it would be easy and consequence-free to do so, is one of the clearest tests of whether a person's relationship with power has remained healthy or has curdled into something closer to compulsion. Multiple historical figures who acquired enormous power, from Roman emperors to modern corporate executives, are documented across biography and history as having lost this capacity for restraint over time, coming to use available leverage reflexively, regardless of whether a situation actually called for it. This pattern tends to accelerate a person's eventual downfall because reflexive, unrestrained use of power generates far more accumulated resentment and coordinated opposition than judicious, selective use of the same underlying power ever would. The practical test worth applying to yourself, especially as you get more comfortable with the tools in this book, is this. Before using leverage you clearly have, ask honestly whether using it in this specific instance is actually necessary to achieve something that matters, or whether you're using it simply because it's available and using it feels satisfying in the moment. The first justification is strategic. The second is closer to the compulsive misuse of power that has ended more careers and reputations throughout history than almost any external rival ever could. Mastery of power, in the fullest sense Machiavelli's better readers have always understood, includes the mastery of knowing when to leave it fully sheathed. Law 28. Recognize these rules when used against you. You've now spent 27 laws learning how to wield influence deliberately. This law flips the lens entirely, because you're far more likely, across an ordinary life, to encounter these techniques being used on you than to need most of them yourself in their full offensive form. And recognizing the pattern in real time is the single most valuable defensive skill this book can offer you. Start by returning to Law 1. Never reveal your full intentions. If someone in your life consistently seems to know exactly what you want before you've said it, and consistently seems one step ahead in negotiations or arguments, consider whether they are deliberately withholding their own position while extracting yours. A useful, concrete tell. Notice whether a specific person's questions to you are frequently more numerous and more probing than their own disclosures about themselves. That asymmetry, sustained over time, is a reasonably reliable signal that someone is gathering information deliberately, rather than simply being naturally curious. Return to Law 8, the illusion of choice. If you frequently find yourself feeling like you've made a decision, only to realize afterward that every option you were actually offered led toward the same underlying outcome someone else wanted, you've likely encountered this technique. The defensive move. Before accepting any offered choice, explicitly ask yourself what options weren't presented to you, and why not return to Law 10, flattery as a Trojan horse. The most useful defensive habit here is a brief, deliberate pause between receiving a compliment and acting on the reduced skepticism that compliment naturally produces in you. Notice the compliment. Appreciate it if it's genuine, but treat it as a separate question from whatever request or proposal follows it. Return to Law 18. Isolation before persuasion, the most serious pattern in this entire book. If you notice a person in your life, romantic partner, friend, employer, even a family member, consistently, gradually discouraging your other relationships, expressing disproportionate frustration when you seek outside perspectives, or subtly positioning themselves as the only person whose judgment you should trust, treat this as a genuine warning sign deserving serious attention, not affectionate devotion. The clearest defensive practice against this specific pattern is structural. Deliberately maintain multiple independent relationships and sources of outside perspective throughout your life, so that no single relationship, however important, ever becomes your only source of social or informational grounding. Return to Law 25, Manufactured Crisis. If someone repeatedly creates urgent, high-pressure situations that demand immediate decisions from you without time for careful consideration, and you notice this pattern happening with unusual regularity relative to how often genuine emergencies actually occur, consider whether some of those crises are being manufactured or exaggerated specifically to bypass your normal decision-making process. The defense here is procedural. Build a personal rule, decided in advance during a calm moment, that major decisions require some minimum period of reflection regardless of how urgent they're presented as being. And hold to that rule, even when someone is actively pressuring you to abandon it. The broader defensive skill underlying all of these specific tells is the same one this entire book has been trying to build in you from the first law. The habit of noticing the mechanism operating underneath a social interaction, not just the content of what's being said. Machiavelli wrote The Prince to teach rulers how to wield power, reading it as a citizen rather than a ruler, which is the position nearly everyone reading this book actually occupies most of the time. Transforms the same material into a field guide for recognizing exactly when someone else is applying it to you. Law 29, the ethical line, power without becoming a monster. I've drawn ethical lines throughout nearly every law of this book, and I want to bring them together now, because I don't think a book like this is honest if it pretends the tools it teaches are ethically neutral in every application. They aren't. Some of what you've read can build genuinely healthy relationships and legitimate influence. Some of it, applied without restraint, causes real and lasting harm to other people. The difference isn't always the technique itself. It's almost always the intention behind it and the honesty of what's actually being offered in return. Here's the test I'd genuinely encourage you to apply, more useful in practice than any abstract philosophical framework. Before using any tool from this book, ask yourself honestly whether the other person, if they fully understood exactly what you were doing and why, would still consider the interaction fair. Specific flattery that's actually true, and that opens a genuine conversation, passes this test easily. Isolating a partner from their support network specifically to make them easier to control fails this test catastrophically. No reasonable person, understanding exactly what was being done to them, would consider that fair, which is precisely why it's practiced covertly rather than openly in every documented case of coercive control. Machiavelli himself never fully grappled with this distinction because his explicit subject was the survival and success of rulers, evaluated almost entirely by outcomes for the ruler, with only secondary attention to the well-being of the ruled. This is the genuinely dark core of his original work, worth being honest about rather than softening. But 5 centuries of subsequent moral philosophy, psychology, and accumulated human experience give us tools Machiavelli didn't have, and one of the clearest is this. Power built on outcomes that would collapse under full transparency is fundamentally unstable. Not just morally troubling but strategically fragile, because full transparency eventually arrives in almost every sustained relationship. Power built on outcomes that would survive full transparency, genuine value delivered, genuine strengths honestly presented, genuine choices genuinely offered, doesn't face this same fragility. Because there's no hidden mechanism whose eventual discovery threatens to unravel everything built on top of it. This is, I think, the most important reframe this book has to offer. The tools of influence and control aren't inherently corrupting. What corrupts is using them to extract value from people without their genuine, informed consent to the exchange, taking their trust, effort, or loyalty while giving back less than what they believe they're receiving in return. Use the other way. in service of exchanges that would survive full honesty about how they were constructed. These same tools become something closer to skill, the skill of understanding people accurately and building influence that rests on a genuinely solid foundation. You will meet people throughout your life who use these tools purely extractively. Understanding the mechanisms in this book means you'll recognize them faster and suffer less damage than you otherwise would have. You will also, if you're honest with yourself, occasionally feel the pull toward using these tools extractively, particularly under real competitive pressure. The discipline this law asks of you isn't pretending that pull doesn't exist. It's building, in advance, the internal clarity about your own lines that makes it easier to recognize and resist that pull when it arrives. Law 30. Exit every game stronger than you entered. We end where every serious study of power eventually has to end. Not with a single dramatic victory, but with the quieter, harder discipline of ensuring that every situation you move through leaves you in a stronger overall position than you were in before. Regardless of the specific immediate outcome of that individual situation. Machiavelli's own life is the most instructive case study available for this final rule. He never fully regained the political position he lost in 1512. His attempt to win back Medici favor through the prince largely failed during his own lifetime. Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom the book was dedicated, reportedly paid it little attention. Machiavelli died in 1527, still largely out of favor, having never returned to the political influence he'd once held as Florence's second chancery secretary. By the narrowest measure of his own stated goal, winning back a government position, his most famous work was, in his own lifetime, a failure. And yet here you are, 500 years later, having just finished a book built entirely on the durability of his ideas. Machiavelli's actual long-term position, measured across centuries rather than within his own lifetime, is almost incomparably stronger than it was before he wrote The Prince. His name became a permanent fixture in political philosophy, and his framework for understanding power remains sharp enough, 5 centuries on, to organize an entire book teaching it to you. He lost the specific game he thought he was playing. He won a considerably larger one he may not have fully realized he was playing at the time. This is the final reframe this book can offer you. Stop measuring every individual interaction purely by its immediate visible outcome and start asking a longer, quieter question after every significant situation you move through. Am I leaving this stronger than I entered it, in ways that will actually compound over time? Sometimes the immediate outcome and the long-term position point in the same direction. Often they don't. A negotiation you technically lost on price might have built a relationship and reputation for fair dealing that generates far more value over the following years than the marginal dollars you conceded. The 30 rules in this book are tools, not a complete philosophy of how to live. Used well, with the restraint discussed in Laws 27 through 29, they'll help you see clearly in situations where most people are navigating blind, protect you from manipulation you would otherwise have missed, and give you real, legitimate influence over outcomes that matter to you. Used carelessly, they can also make you effective at damaging people and relationships in ways that eventually damage you far more than whatever you originally extracted. Machiavelli didn't get to choose how history would remember him. Machiavellian became a byword for pure cynical manipulation, a somewhat unfair flattening of a more complicated thinker who also wrote extensively about civic virtue and the common good. You do get to choose how the people in your life remember you, based on how you actually use what you now understand about power. Choose the version of this knowledge that leaves you, and the people who matter to you, genuinely stronger for having known you. That is the real, lasting form of control this book has been about all along. Conclusion. Machiavelli's true legacy. 500 years after his death, Niccolò Machiavelli remains one of the most misquoted and most consistently relevant thinkers in the history of political thought. Most people who invoke his name have never read The Prince cover to cover, and fewer still have read the Discourses on Livy, his longer work, which spends considerably more time on the virtues of republican government and shared power than the popular caricature of Machiavellian ever suggests. What you've read across these 30 laws isn't a simple endorsement of ruthlessness. It's closer to what Machiavelli was actually attempting, a clear-eyed description of how influence and power genuinely operate among human beings, stripped of comfortable illusions. That clarity is valuable regardless of how you choose to use it, because remaining sincerely unaware of these mechanisms doesn't protect you from them. It only ensures you'll encounter them unprepared, as most people do throughout their lives. I said at the beginning of this book that I wouldn't ask you to become a monster, and I meant it. What I've actually asked is that you stop being naive about how the social and professional world genuinely operates, while remaining deliberate and honest about which of these tools you're willing to use and toward what ends. That combination, clear sight without cynicism, capability without cruelty, is the most genuinely powerful position available to anyone, more durable than either the naive idealist who refuses to see how power works, or the unrestrained operator who sees it clearly but applies it without any consideration for the people on the other end of it. Go forward seeing clearly. That, in the end, was always the actual goal.